Was Freud a genius or just recycling ancient philosophy? His theory shaped modern psychology, but I personally suspect he drew more of his so-called groundbreaking ideas from the writings of Aristotle than scientific observations. Love him or hate him, virtually everyone knows the name Sigmund Freud and his famous coining of terms like narcissism and the Oedipus complex. These terms, which he attributed to states of the mind, reflect his interest in ancient literature. However, I suspect Freud was more than just inspired by these stories. I think he appropriated, or in some instances misappropriated, Greek philosophy without giving due attribution to where he got his ideas from, in particular, the works of Aristotle. To examine this, we need to look at the foundation of Freud's hypotheses. He inserted that the human mind consists of a superego and an id, which are supposedly two opposing forces which wrestle for control over the ego. I think the German words used to describe these concepts explain what Freud meant with much greater clarity. All he is asserting is that there is a superior, more ideal self called the over-I, and an inferior self, which he called the it, that governs passions and primal instincts. Freud's approach to mental health emphasized the role of the unconscious mind in shaping thoughts and emotions and behaviours. When a person experiences psychological crisis or symptoms known as hysteria, it was an outdated term used historically to describe symptoms of PTSD or other trauma-related disorders, Freud theorized that these symptoms arose from unresolved unconscious conflicts. Conflicts stemmed from the repression of primal instincts or desires associated with the id, the part of the psyche defined as being driven by basic needs and urges, including sexuality and aggression. The superego was at the other end of the spectrum, part of the psyche that represented internalized moral standards and societal values, acting as a conscious to regulate the desires of the id and the reasoning of the ego. Psychoanalysis aimed to uncover repressed material and bring unconscious conflicts into conscious awareness. This process, called catharsis, was intended to relieve psychological stress. Freud also argued that women had a weaker superego and were driven more by their id. He also indicated that men had a stronger superego that was somehow tied to the fact that they had a penis. Now, before moving on to how this relates to Greek philosophy, I'd like to emphasize that the amount of scientific support for Freud's construct of the mind is zero. There is absolutely no evidence to support the notion that the human psyche is made up of a superego and id, which the ego struggles to mediate between the Contemporary neuroscience explains symptoms like those described in Freud's hypotheses of hysteria in terms of nervous system functioning and cognitive processes. Freud was introduced to Aristotle's work while he was a student at the University of Vienna, where he participated in lectures by Franz Renato, who was a philosopher and psychologist known for his work on theories of consciousness and empirical observation. At this point in time, Vienna was a hub of intellectual activity, and Renato influenced many other men who would go on to be renowned in their own right. To illustrate how I came to the conclusion that Freud appropriated Aristotle, it's essential to explore Aristotle's background and the prominence of his influence in Western education. Aristotle was a student of Plato's academy for about 20 years. Plato placed a lot of emphasis on geometry, which he believed helped train the mind to grasp abstract external truths. He argued geometry helped individuals think beyond the physical realm towards the realm of forms. The theory of forms suggested that behind the material world were building blocks of a perfect reality. In addition to Plato's wisdom, during his time at the Academy, Aristotle became familiar with the work of many other great philosophers. Upon leaving Plato's Academy, Aristotle was employed by Alexander the Great as a tutor. Around the same time that Alexander began his series of conquests, Aristotle returned to Athens and opened up his own school. His teaching methods were different to that of Plato's in a number of ways. Namely, he focused more on observations of the natural world than abstract ideas. Aristotle and Alexander had a mutually influential relationship that shaped both the intellectual and cultural landscapes of their time. Aristotle benefited from Alexander's conquests that stretched from Greece to Egypt and India, which exposed Aristotle to unprecedented access to resources and information from diverse regions. Conversely, as Alexander was Aristotle's former student, the dissemination of Greek culture and philosophy in conquered territories had a very Aristotelian slant. The influence of Alexander is often referred to as Hellenization. The synergy of Aristotle and Alexander led to Greek education and philosophy being promoted in the newly established cities like Alexandria, which became one of the most important hubs of learning in antiquity. In essence, Aristotle indirectly shaped the intellectual underpinnings of Alexander's empire, which marks a pivotal moment in the development and dissemination of Greek thought. When the Roman Empire rose to prominence and took over the Hellenized regions, education continued under the Greek model. Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century, formal education in that region had a period of decline. However, in the East Roman Empire, it continued under Hellenistic influence, albeit was Christianized. In very general terms, education of this era consisted of either religious teachings in monasteries or scholastic frameworks. There's quite a bit more to the history of education in this period, but the main point I want to get across is that it was all very much influenced by Aristotle. In Islamic societies, there are several scholars who were studying and developing the ideas of Greek philosophers. As an example, a man named Averroes is often credited with synthesizing Aristotle's philosophy with Muslim beliefs. Averroes Islamatized Aristotle. In Christianity, Thomas Aquinas is credited with doing the same. Aquinas Christianized Aristotle. One of the most interesting examples is that of Aquinas asserting Aristotle was correct when he claimed that a menstruating woman can tarnish a mirror. In his treatise on dreams, Aristotle wrote, "If a woman chances during her menstrual period to look into a highly polished mirror, the surface of it will grow cloudy with a blood-coloured haze. It's very hard to remove the stain from a new mirror, but much easier from an older mirror." And in Thomas Aquinas' summary of Theology, he refers to this when he says, "And the eyes affect the air which is in contact with them to a certain distance, in the same way as a new and clear mirror contacts a tarnish from the look of a menstrua," as Aristotle says. It was superstitions like these that led to women being persecuted as witches. So when I say education was based on Aristotle, I mean his writings were the standard textbook. When it comes to topics like poetry and drama, I can really appreciate how insightful he was. However, when it comes to the sciences, while he did magnificent work and can be applauded for laying a lot of groundwork in regards to categorization, observations, and other things, he also got some things grossly wrong, like saying that women had less teeth than men. This point really throws me. It would not have been that difficult to count women's and men's teeth and to discover that they both had the same amount. Aristotle was indisputably very misogynistic, and it was through his so-called authority on matters pertaining to gender that many patriarchal structures throughout history have asserted and maintained their power structure. It was not until the late 1500s that Aristotle's authority was significantly challenged. The Reformation and the scientific revolution were, in many respects, a revolt against Aristotle. Key figures who led these advancements were Copernicus, Galileo, Prasse, Bacon, Newton, and Martin Luther. There's a lot more to add to these examples, and the Church's position of upholding Aristotle's authority, but for the purpose of getting back to Freud, I'll leave it at that. So just to recap a little, Western education from antiquity through to the formation of the Holy Roman Church was based upon ancient Greek philosophy. Following this, Christianity and Islamic values reshaped some aspects of education, but it was still fundamentally based upon the premise that the Greek philosophy, in particular Aristotle, was absolutely correct. Of all the things Aristotle and some other Greek philosophers got wrong, it's imperative to acknowledge they did not understand the human reproduction process like we do today. Basically, Aristotle believed procreation was achieved by male and female seeds that, when combined, produced another human being. The theory stipulated that males had a seed that carried an active force that shaped the offspring, while the female seed provided the material matter of a human being. Aristotle specifically believed that sperm provided the form or the blueprint for creating life. He asserted that this was a source that contained all human traits and was the driving force behind reproduction. Aristotle's theory continued, with the female contribution being the provision of matter through menstrual blood. Sperm was understood to contribute form, and the physical body was created solely by the woman. Aristotle also believed in spontaneous generation, that is, some life forms could arise from non-living matter. Aristotle's views were based on crude observations of animals like chickens. In Aristotle's words, they appear to come into being from semen, but in another sense not so, and in one way they are spontaneously generated. To put it quite simply, his understanding of reproduction was wrong. Nonetheless, Aristotle's hypotheses were upheld as being accurate. Corrections to the understanding of human reproduction did not begin to occur until the scientific revolution, and it was not until the 19th century that the human fertilization process based on sperm and ova became crystal clear. As for DNA, chromosomes, and so forth, understanding these things emerged to the late 19th through to the 20th century. Essentially, up until 200 years ago, human reproduction was solely understood through an Aristotelian lens by most people. Even 100 years ago, most people did not understand the reproduction process like we do today. The ignorance and naivety of human reproduction in the past is the basis of the belief that women could conceive a child who is fathered by the gods, or in the case of Christianity and Mary, who was supposedly conceived by the Holy Spirit. Our ancestors believed these stories because they did not understand the fertilization process and the role of genetics like we do. How this logic worked will become a little bit clearer once I've explained the ancient Greek philosophy of the elements. Understanding the elements and its associated beliefs is central to how it played out in ancient Greek thought. Most people have heard of earth, water, air, and fire in association with Greek philosophy, although what a lot of people don't realise is that these held deep significance beyond their iconic representation. At an indexical level, the elements signified realms of existence, which I'll walk through now. At the lowest level is earth, which is the physical realm, which refers to minerals, dirt, rock, and base elements. A step up is water, which represents ether or life force, and within this realm are plants and any sort of vegetation. Then we have air, which is also sometimes referred to as the soul realm, and this encompasses animals and all sentient beings. Next we have fire, which is also sometimes referred to as the spirit realm, and this is the realm of humans and maybe some deities as well. These four elements are the ones that are most commonly referred to in ancient literature. However, there was a fifth element, which Aristotle called aether, which could also be described as the celestial fire to distinguish it from the terrestrial fire. The fifth, less talked about realm is the divine realm. So in this highest level is the heavens and deities. I cannot emphasize enough that this was the basis of all Greek philosophy, and there is a lot to stack on top of this, so I'll just go through some of the basics. The first four elements represent the collective realm of human beings. That is, the basic constitution of people were understood to be created by earth, water, air, and fire, with the caveat that there were some gender nuances, which I'll cover shortly. Zodiac terminology links into this, as do other subjects pertaining to health, such as the four humours, which also correlate to four temperaments. I'll just briefly run through these. Earth was associated with black bile, which had the features of being cold and dry, and the temperament of melancholy. Water was associated with phlegm, which was cold and moist, and the temperament phlegmatic. Then for air, we have blood, warm and moist, and sanguine temperament. Fire is yellow bile, warm and dry, and choleric. Plato also attributed platonic solids to each of the elements. The fifth element was referred to as the universe because it was the most complex. When it is said that the platonic solids are the basis of all life, this is highly symbolic. To go a little deeper, the elements were also affiliated with deities. Empedocles, who was a generation or two older than Plato, tells us that the earth is Hades, water is Persephone, air is Hera, and fire is Zeus. He doesn't directly assign any deities to the celestial fire, but my reading of his text is that when he talks of love and strife being the binder and divider of all other elements, I think he's hinting to them being representative of the higher realm. All Greek mythology is based upon telling stories that try to explain the role of the elements. Poetry, like Homer's Iliad, was a means of the Greek relaying their understanding of the world in such a way that only those who were initiated, that is, those who knew the coded language, could interpret the information. I suspect variations of the myths are indicative of debates between philosophers. Plato marks a turning point in the tradition of exploring philosophy. He was originally a poet, however he gave up this practice when he was young and embraced the format of dialogues. Nonetheless, his work still can be seen as continuing premises set by the previous philosophers who did use poetry. For example, in Symposium, he suggests that there are two Aphrodites, a heavenly one and a more common earthly kind of love. Plato also tells us that the nature of the soul was the most commonly debated topic among philosophers, which is a really important point to remember. I could go into a lot more detail about all of this, but I'm just going to say enough so as it relates back to Freud. If you're watching this, consider yourself privileged. The symbolic significance of the elements was not shared freely amongst the Greeks. The information was once considered to be sacred, only allowed to be shared with those who had been through initiation processes. The history books are a bit sketchy, but from what I can gather, information and stories about the elements were shared in places like the Elysian Mystery School. Once Greek mythology and philosophy moved into other education places, opposed to the traditional indoctrination process, it's questionable as to who knew the association of the elements and who just saw them at face value. As a side note, I'd also like to mention that other civilizations, like the Egyptians, worked in a similar manner debating the nature of life. However, their theology stemmed from different premises. Rather than viewing the elements as being in a hierarchical structure, they viewed them as interacting with each other in a harmonious way. Here's a simple visual comparison. Keep in mind though, I'm oversimplifying things here a little, and I'm just including a reference to Egyptian theology as a means of making the point that the ancient Greek framework was not universal amongst all civilizations. There are sources to suggest that the theology of the four elements originated in Babylon, and the Greeks only ended upon it. So winding back a little, let's look at the basic Greek elements again. When dialogues began replacing poetry as a means of exploring philosophy, some alternative terminology was introduced. Namely, the element of air became referred to as the irrational soul, fire the rational soul, and the celestial fire as nous. Regardless of the terminology, there was still a hierarchy of elements that clearly demonstrated the value system of the ancient Greeks, whereby intelligence was held in the highest regard and physical matter the lowest. Other terminology associated with discussing the elements that appear from the time of Plato and onwards are prime mover, cause, and principle, which I don't need to go into detail right now. I'm just mentioning them to illustrate how Greek philosophy evolved into new language during the classical period. Unlike modern society, the Greeks did not universally associate intelligence with the brain. Some did, like Hippocrates and Plato, but others, like Aristotle, believed that rational thought emanated from the heart and that thoughts were a spiritual adaptation. Indications that thought was external to the brain are recognizable in supernatural beliefs like that of the entities known as daemon or genies, who were said to bring ideas to people. These spirit entities were believed to guide and influence individuals or events. Within this framework, it was also believed that if a person didn't respond to a message from a genie, it would move on to another person. It is from the term genie that we derive the concept of a genius, that is, someone who is in possession of superior or renowned intelligence. Conversely, the idea of demons talking to people is derived from the Greek notion of daemon. Not all Greek philosophers adhered to these notions of thought, positive or negative, being external forces, but it appears that Aristotle may have. He understood the heart to be the primary organ responsible for thought. The lack of importance that he placed on the functions of the brain are indicative in his description of the brain being a compound of earth and water elements. To understand how the ancient Greeks perceived the construction of human beings, the depiction of concentric circles can help. This begins with the physical body in the centre, which is then surrounded by ether, a life force that was believed to give material life the ability to grow. Next is the soul body, specifically the irrational soul, which is probably the most complicated. It was perceived by the Greeks to provide primal instincts such as the desire to satisfy hunger and the urge to procreate. However, it also housed more complex emotions like loyalty, honour, willpower, and courage. Theories of the soul body were diverse. Philosophers like Plato subdivided it into multiple subcategories. The rational soul, which is sometimes referred to as the spirit body, was considered to be the place where intelligence emanated from. Like the soul body, the nature of the spirit body was complex, and there are a lot of debates surrounding its precise nature. And on the outer rim is the rest of the universe. So this is the simple version of how a human being can be represented. Aristotle's full cosmology was a lot more detailed, as can be seen here. This model of a human being was considered to be the microcosm of the universe, hence the belief that the sun revolved around the earth, which was upheld as absolute truth by the church. As a side note, it's remarkable that anyone who challenged the Aristotle view risked being labelled a heretic and faced Inquisition trials. The late 16th and early 17th centuries were especially challenging for scientists. Interestingly, some ancient Greek philosophers had already used mathematical reasoning to propose that the earth revolved around the sun. Although their ideas failed to gain traction in their time, it's striking that the church later prohibited even questioning the validity of Aristotle's model. According to basic Greek philosophy of the classical era, this section in the box denotes the basic construct of humans: a physical body, life force, sentient soul qualities, and a spirit. Further intricacies of this framework involve various levels within each category. Fish, for example, could be considered closer to the ether realm than mammals, and some mammals, like horses, could be ranked higher due to displaying higher levels of intelligence. In Aristotle's first book of Politics, he goes into detail about how people could be characterized, which looks something like this. Children were considered to be closer to the animal realm. If they were male, they could grow closer to the spirit realm. And if they demonstrated superior intellect, they would be considered to be closer to the gods, therefore entitled to roles of divine rulership. Female children were a little lower than their male peers, and as adults, they were never as high as men, except maybe in households where there were male slaves. Royal women and virgins may be considered to be higher. Aristotle applied this rigid hierarchy to everything, as indicated in the first book of Politics, in which he wrote, "The male is by nature superior, and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind." The full extent of Aristotle's influence across cultures and ages is laid out in Dante's poetic commentary of the Monarchy. The differentiating characteristic in man is not simple existence, for that is shared by the elements, nor existence in combination, for that is met in minerals, nor existence emanate, for that is found in plants, nor existence intelligent, for that is participated in by brutes. The characteristic competent to man alone, and to none other above or below him, is existence intelligence through the possible intellect. Although other beings possess intellect, it is not intellect distinguished by potentiality, as is man's. The chapter ends with Dante paying homage to Aristotle. "I speak of things to be done, which are controlled by political sagacy, and things to be made, which are controlled by art, because they are all handmaidens of speculation, that supreme end for which the primal good brought into being the human race." From this now grows clear the saying in the Politics, "The vigorous in intellect naturally govern other men." It is within this framework that the theory of procreation can be better understood. Because women were believed to be on the lower elemental scale, that meant their seed contained the inferior elements of earth and water, and the male seed contained air and fire, the intellect and the soul. Aristotle believed that anything that belonged to the earth and water realm could generate itself, whereas air and fire elements gave life to these lower elements. So with this model of reproduction and the assumption that spontaneous generation of life was possible, it's not much of a stretch to assume women could be impregnated by the, in quotes, seed of the celestial fire too. I'm quite certain this is how myths and legends of men who showed great intellect or leadership were believed to be the products of gods. In ancient Greek, Plato and Alexander the Great are among those whose mothers were supposedly impregnated by a deity, and no doubt also contributed to the belief that Jesus was born to a virgin mother. Additionally, it can be noted that virginity was perceived to be a superior state of being because of the hierarchy of what was considered to be perfect and imperfect was reflected in the dichotomy of good and evil, intellect and the physical body, with the soul being the mediator of the two. Having an intellect that controls the soul's passions, including physical gratification, was viewed as being more perfect, more superior to an inferior soul that neglected the intellect in the process of engaging in sexual intercourse. We can see all of this happening in Christianity in Thomas Aquinas' Summary of Theology, where he completely endorses the Aristotelian framework of both procreation and the value of virginity in a number of passages. It's quite wordy what he's written, so I'll just summarise what's up on the screen. Essentially, what Aquinas is saying is that the male component of sexual intercourse is a superior spiritual activity that involves the resolution of the semen, which causes sensible pleasure, whereas the female component is tied to the physical elements that obtain the pleasure of the semen. Because the lower elements are viewed as inferior, intercourse was seen as spiritual corruption, or that of the soul's passions governing the physical body. In Aquinas' words, since then, virginity consists in the freedom from the aforesaid corruption. It follows that the integrity of the bodily organ is accidental to virginity, while freedom from pleasure in the resolution of semen is related thereto materially, and the purpose of perpetually abstaining from this pleasure is the formal and completive element in virginity. Aquinas also says, Mary hath chosen the better part. Of these goods that are external are directed to those which belong to the body, and those which belong to the body are directed to those which belong to the soul. And furthermore, those which belong to the active life are directed to those which belong to the life of contemplation. The reference here to the goods that are external is indicative of intellectual thinking process being perceived as a spiritual activity that exists outside the body. Aquinas' writings also indicate that this framework was used by the writers of the New Testament. He says, if a man abstains from bodily pleasures in order more freely to give himself to the contemplation of truth, this in accordance with the rectitude of reason. Now holy virginity refrains from all perennial pleasure in order more freely to have leisure for divine contemplation. For the Apostle says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34, the unmarried woman and the virgin thinketh of the things of the Lord, that she may be holy in both body and in spirit. But she that is married thinketh of the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Therefore it follows that virginity, instead of being sinful, is worthy of praise. Aquinas also explores the idea that Jesus did not have a soul, a dialogue that reflects an understanding of the human being and the reproduction process in a very nuanced manner that the casual reader of the text may miss. They don't understand the framework of the elemental hierarchy. I understand that Christianity, in particular early Christianity, used symbolism that they inherited from Hebrew traditions, such as referring to Mary as being the mother of the church. However, when it comes to issues pertaining to Jesus being the same substance as God and being born to a virgin mother, these beliefs are grounded in ancient Greek philosophy, which in turn is based upon flawed understandings of reproduction and brain functions. Which begs the question, when did the Holy Roman Catholic Church realize that they had got it all wrong? I shudder to think how many people, in particular scientists, suffered the consequences of Inquisition trials and being labelled a heretic for disagreeing to the Church's theology that was not open to debate. The lack of transparency is both curious and disturbing. I don't know all the details of Islamic history as well as I do Christianity. However, it is my basic understanding that they also have a legacy of secret doctrines based upon Aristotle's models of elemental hierarchy, which underpin their beliefs. Averroes, in his divisive treatise, in which the nature of the connection between religion and philosophy, he says, allegorical interpretations, then, ought not to be expressed to the masses, nor set down in rhetoric or dialectical books. He justifies this by stating, to explain the inner meaning to people unable to understand it is to destroy their belief in the apparent meaning without putting anything in its place. The result is unbelief in learners and teachers. It is best for the learned to profess ignorance, quoting the Quran on the limitation of man's understanding. I speculate that the Christian Church had a similar maximum in which they too kept allegorical interpretations of biblical narratives from the masses. The prospect that religious leaders have deliberately lied to people for centuries does not sit well with me. I think the Vatican has some serious questions to answer, but this video is primarily about Freud, so I'll leave that for another day. The two-seed theory of procreation, whereby it was believed that a man's seed, the active force, created the form of a baby, and the woman's seed was passive and contributed to the material substance, dominated science and religion all the way up to the 1600s. The roles of ova and sperm were not fully understood until the 1800s. Oscar Hertwig confirmed the process of human reproduction in 1875. DNA and chromosomes were the next big pieces of the puzzle as we moved towards the 20th century. Freud must have been aware of at least some of these scientific discoveries. However, it appears to me that he placed more credence on Aristotle's writings. Here's a couple of quotes from Freud. We have formed the idea that in each individual there is a coherent organisation of mental processes. We call this the ego. It is the ego that the consciousness is attached. The ego approaches to mortality, that is, to the discharge of excitations into the external world. It is the mental agency which supervises all its own constituent processes. The ego represents what may be called reason and common sense, in contrast to the id, which contains the passions. The male sex seems to have taken the lead in all of the moral acquisitions. She acknowledges the fact of her castration, and with it too the superiority of the male and her own inferiority. I'm not the first to argue that Freud appropriated ancient Greek philosophy. In a recent article in Psychology Today, Dr. Cohen argues that Freud imitated Plato's model of dividing the human psyche. Further, that he did not give appropriate credit for doing so. While my personal view is that Freud borrowed more from Aristotle than Plato due to the misogynistic attitudes identified in both, I can see Plato's influence in Freud's work also, namely in his metaphoric description of the ego being like a horse that is being pulled in two directions, one being the superego and the other being the id. Freud says, functional importance of the ego is manifested in the fact that normally control over the approaches to mortality derives upon it. Thus, in relation to the id, it is like a man on horseback who is to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. With this difference, the rider tries to do so with his own strength while the ego uses borrowed forces. The analogy may be carried a little further. Often if he is to be parted from the horse, he is obligated to guide it to where it wants to go. So in the same way, the ego is in the habit of transforming the id's will into action as if it was its own. This reminds me of what Plato said about humans being like a chariot rider who is pulled in two directions. Plato said, we liken the soul to the composite nature of a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the horses and the charioteer of the gods are all good and of good descent, but those of other races are mixed. And first the charioteer of the human soul drives a pair, and secondly, one of the horses is noble and of noble breed, but the other is quite the opposite breed and character. Therefore, in our case, the driving is necessarily difficult and troublesome. We must try to tell why a living being is called mortal or immortal. Plato was a man of his time, yet he had at least 2 female students attend his academy, in contrast to Aristotle, who had no female students attend his school. Plato challenged common attitudes, whereas Aristotle exacerbated them with comments like these. Men must be either of a higher or lower type, for moral character mainly answers to these divisions, goodness and badness being the distinguishing marks of moral differences. The deliberative part of the soul in a woman is lacking in authority. The female, as it were, a mutated male. To further emphasise that Aristotelian attitudes were not universal in the ancient world, the writings of Emperor Julian, the last pagan emperor, shows us some interesting opposition to Aristotle's philosophy. Julian tells us that some philosophers thought Aristotle was absurd when discussing the fifth or the cyclic substance, and Julian himself believed Aristotle was incomplete unless brought into harmony with Plato. So, to sum up a bit, I think Freud, in general terms, appropriated the general tendency of ancient Greek philosophy of viewing the mind as being subdivided, which he called the superego and the id. Specifically, I think he took Aristotle's perspective as an authority, which happened to be drenched in misogyny. Further, Freud's drawing upon ancient myths and legends to uphold his hypotheses are fundamentally flawed, based on the fact that these myths and legends are based upon an erroneous understanding of reproduction, the brain's thinking processes, and attitudes towards virginity. The hierarchical representation of elements is absurd. It is also absurd that power structure was upheld as gospel in political, religious, and social circumstances for so long. Needless to say, the constructs that Freud based on so-called mythical truths are fundamentally flawed because he did not understand the theology that they were based upon. The unpacking of symbolism in historical myths and legends is a long and laborious task. So I'll just say a few general comments that may help to better understand how they could be viewed. Take, for example, the story of Prometheus. Prometheus shaped man out of mud, mud being a combination of earth and water elements. Athena breathed life into man, so we can assume Athena belongs to the realm of air. Prometheus then tricked Zeus into giving man fire, a clear indication that Zeus is a representative of the fire realm. Zeus, disappointed that his intellect had been infringed upon, created Pandora, who complicated everything with her box of emotions that flew into the air. Another key point to keep in mind is that Greek is a gendered language in which nouns are grammatically male or female. In English we don't do this, but in places that this does occur, it flows through to concepts, in this case spiritual concepts, becoming personified in accordance with linguistic associations. As a general rule, earth entities like Hades are male, water are feminine, like Persephone, air is also feminine, like Hera, fire is masculine, like Zeus, and the celestial could be male, female, or non-binary, but this picture is incomplete. Many male and female depictions in Greek mythology are not strictly superior or inferior. As indicated by Empedocles, the stories of the Greek gods and goddesses were not literal. They are the personification of complex and sophisticated philosophy. Nike, the spirit of victory and determination. Eros, the spirit of passion and attraction. Aphrodite, the spirit of love, beauty, and desire. Ares, the spirit of war, aggression, and courage. Zeus, the spirit of leadership, justice, and decision-making. Poseidon, the spirit of rage and anger. When these deities interact with each other, the stories represent an exploration of the vast variety of human thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. It is fitting that Ares, the god of war, would give birth to Nike, the goddess of victory. Likewise, that Zeus, as an aspect of intellect, would have many lovers and father many children. While myths can be intellectualized and analyzed, I believe their greatest value lies in celebrating the creative impulse of humanity and their enduring capacity to unite people through joy, laughter, and shared experience. The saying, "whoever is the loudest wins the debate," is a proverbial sentiment derived from the ancient Greek school of philosophy known as the sophists, who were professional teachers and auditors who taught the art of persuasion, sometimes emphasizing emotional appeal, pathos, and clever argumentation over logical soundness, logos, or ethical integrity, ethos. Critics, including Plato, accuse sophists of manipulating rhetoric to win debates rather than seeking objective truth. Aristotle outlined the concepts for logos, ethos, and pathos as being three pillars of persuasive rhetoric, and it is fair to say he was an expert in applying these principles, so much so that his authority endured for thousands of years in various contexts, namely education, religion, and political institutions. Freud also applied these pillars to his assertions of psychoanalytic theory, and in doing so contributed to him becoming known as the father of modern psychology, a status which in my humble opinion would be better bestowed upon Renato. Before finishing up, I also want to mention that Freud's appropriation of Aristotle that I've mentioned in this video is just the tip of the iceberg. For example, in the paper Transference and Catharsis, Freud to Aristotle, Maria Turi suggests that Freud's theory of transference can suggest a new interpretation of Aristotle's tragic catharsis. Turi further argues that the dynamic between emotional arousement in reenactment and emotional distancing in analysis offers an effective parallel between catharsis of fear and catharsis of pity in Aristotle's theory. Additionally, others like Professor Frederick Kruse are highly critical of Freud's lack of scientific process to arrive at his ideas. Kruse critiques Freud's processes as starting out with a theory and then working backwards, seeking out tidbits to reinforce belief, then aggressively dismissing anything else that challenges those ideas. Once upon a time, I was a great fan of Freud's. As a teenager and budding young artist, I was enthralled by surrealism and its underlying ideas of the unconscious mind. However, over the years, as I have learned more about neuroscience and robust theories of psychology, I struggle to understand how Freud was ever taken seriously. Perhaps it's because I've grown up with the understanding that there is no difference in intellectual potential across genders. Moreover, that the brain is the organ of thought, and reproduction is not a mysterious process. There is no difference between a male and female brain, just as there is no difference between other internal organs like the heart, lungs, kidney, and so forth. I now theorise that Freud's work was not popular because it was accurate, but because it was somehow novel, yet also contained enough elements of familiarity to resonate with the audiences he presented it to. Familiarity, however, does not mean truth. While I'm highly critical of Freud's lack of transparency in disclosing the level of influence that Aristotle must have had on his work, perhaps I'm being a little bit too harsh. After all, it's quite clear that leaders of political and religious institutions have been doing exactly the same thing for thousands of years. The elements of familiarity that Freud drew upon were his references to religious narratives supporting long-held political hierarchies, in particular those which supported stereotypical gender identity, which all echo Aristotle's authority. And underlying all of this are the misogynistic attitudes of patriarchy, an ideology designed to oppress both men and women and uphold a selected few as being closer to the divine. And behind all of these features are the elements of coercive control, behaviours that I believe need to be clearly understood as being the driving force behind a lot of abuse and traumatic experiences. Maybe Freud's greatest downfall is that he wasn't able to expose this, that he didn't look deeper into the myths and legends that he was exploring. At worst, some of these stories can be viewed as being nothing more than ancient propaganda, or at best, a display of ignorance and naivety. A point on which Freud, I think, almost got it right was actually his Madonna whore complex, a concept that suggests men have a psychological split whereby they perceive women as either pure and virtuous, Madonnas, or sexually promiscuous and morally corrupt, that is, whores. Within the context of Aristotle's elements and his hierarchy of human beings and reproduction, this is pretty much true. Aristotle presented women as being of the lowest of the elements, inferior beings in comparison to the superior male who supposedly had magical sperm that could generate life out of woman's menstrual blood. In accordance with Aristotelian logic, the only way that women could avoid being mere sanguine creatures was if they were virgins, because virginity for both men and women was considered to be an act of denying the lower elements while aspiring to the higher ones. To his credit, Freud actually recognised that this dichotomy was preventing men from having healthy, happy relationships, And he was partly correct when he said that this was due to complex, unresolved experiences from childhood societal influences. However, this idea of women being either virgins or whores does not represent natural phenomenon. This skewed presentation of gender is the product of a long history of misunderstanding the science of life and reproduction. Aristotle lived 2,500 years ago, so I don't even have any ill feelings towards him getting it all wrong. What upsets me the most are the coercive control tactics that have been used by institutions to uphold Aristotle as an authority and have gone out of their way to persecute anyone who challenges that authority. I really think it's time we move beyond all of that. We look behind the veil of the past and we see this aspect for what it really is. So in a moment, I'm going to go through my 12 criteria of coercive control and how I think they relate to Freud. I do think that Freud used some coercive control tactics, although probably not as much as what some men before him have. If you haven't already seen it, check out my last video when I do an analysis of the Holy Roman Church at the point in time when it was forming under the influence of Emperor Constantine. I'm going to run through how I think Freud ranks in accordance with the 12 features I like to use to define coercive control. For authoritative leadership, I've given a 3 because Freud insisted his opinions were correct and dismissed those who disagreed with him as being mentally ill. Control over information, I've given a 1 because while he was very selective in the information he disseminated, he did not overtly restrict others from investigating other sources. Deception, I've given a 3 due to his lack of transparency and disclosing the influence Greek philosophers had on his work. Exclusive knowledge, I've given a 3 as well because he asserted psychoanalysis as being irrefutable based on so-called truths of mythology. Exploitation, I've given a 2 due to the excessive therapy sessions clients were required to attend and the accompanying financial expectations that came with these. Additionally, while he did not encourage sexual abuse, he normalised it and reduced the burden of responsibility on perpetrators. For example, promoting the idea that young children were capable of seducing adults. Fear, guilt and intimidation, I've given a 2 because he suggested victims of abuse were in some way responsible for what happened to them through unconscious desires. And as a so-called authoritative figure in psychology, this would have been very intimidating to some people. For isolation, I've given a 1. Freud did not overtly restrict individuals. However, he did foster a tight-knit community of people who agreed with his hypotheses. Micromanagement of daily tasks, I've also given a 1 because clients were obligated to meet with him regularly and he directed them to behave in certain ways that aligned with his belief system. Monitoring thoughts and/or behaviours, I've given a 2 because the very nature of psychoanalysis involved prying into the private lives of clients in an intrusive manner. Punishment and discipline, I've given a 1 due to his punitive remarks towards clients and peers who disagreed with him. Thought reform, I've given a 2 because the entire process of psychoanalysis was a method that can be used as a systemic indoctrination process designed to get people to view the world through his paradigm. Us versus their mentality, I've also given a 2 because he believed psychoanalysis was a groundbreaking discovery and anyone who did not appreciate it was either misunderstood or suffering from emotional resistance. In short, I suspect Freud had a superiority complex. Overall, Freud's cult following amounts to a 6 on my scale, which is the first tier of significant concern. While not an overtly destructive cult, it did have the potential to cause harm, a theme which was picked up on in the 2011 movie about Freud and Jung, titled A Dangerous Method. I'm conscious of having generalised and skimmed over some details, which I hope to expand upon in the future. If you feel inclined, subscribe to be notified when these come out. Until then, remember Little Red Riding Hood. She was deceived by a cunning wolf who distracted her with beautiful flowers that lured her off the path. This story serves as a timeless reminder to stay vigilant and beware of the wolves lurking in the forest.